Hi everyone, welcome to a new week of learning. I saw a lot of you got on last week and did all of your assignments, which is awesome. We're super proud of you. Thank you and keep up the great work. As I said last week, we finished a whole chapter. I can't even believe it. Now we're done with chapter 8 and we're moving into chapter 9. We're actually going to do something kind of easy, kind of hard, but we'll hope to find a nice balance of in between. It'll be a little bit of review mixed in with a little bit of new. We're going to talk about decimals. The cool thing about decimals is we can relate fractions, which we have done, but we can relate those to decimals, which is cool. And I'm going to show you in a little bit. I have a really cool resource that I think you're going to like that I'm hoping that you'll be able to use to help you within the next couple weeks as we dive through chapter 9, because chapter 9 is all about decimals. So for today, we're going to talk about relating tenths and decimals. So now we're actually going to be able to use place value, fractions, and decimals. So we're going to start right here. We're going to look at unlock the problem. Ty is reading a book about metamorphic rocks. He has read 7/10 of the book. What decimal describes the part of the book Ty has read? If we look right here, this is going to tell us what a decimal is. A decimal is a number with one or more digits to the right of the decimal point. You can write tenths and hundreds as fractions of decimals. So today we're going to focus on relating tenths and decimals, and tomorrow we'll get into talking, or on Wednesday, we'll talk about how we can relate hundreds and decimals. So let's look. We want to know what 7/10 is as a decimal, and we can do that. One way that we can do it, actually there's more than one way that we're going to do it. But before we dive into that, I'm going to highlight my important information. We know that he read 7/10 of the book, and we want to know what decimal describes the part of the book Ty has read. I'm also going to star this whole paragraph because that whole thing is pretty important. We don't know what a decimal is because we haven't learned about it yet. And we haven't learned about a decimal point. We're going to learn all about those today. And that's all what chapter 9 is about. So you're going to have a pretty good idea of decimals as we move further. Believe it or not, we just introduced in 4th grade the basics of decimals, and you'll really dive into them next year when you get up into 5th grade. But we like to have a little bit of exposure so you don't not have any idea when you do go to 5th grade. So let's look right here. One way that we can model 7/10 is to use fraction strips, which we have done all along. Okay, so if we look right here, they want us to shade 7/10 of the model. Okay, we know how to do that. We're going to shade 7 pieces. So 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. Oh, and let's count. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7. So from here over is going to be shaded. Remember, it does not have to be perfect. Okay? And it even gives us a little tip. It says, think. The model is divided into 10 equal parts, because remember, that's what our denominator tells us. And each part represents 1/10. So each individual part is 1/10, 1/10, 1/10. We shaded 7/10 to represent the fraction 7/10, and we know we write that as 7/10. Okay, that's our review. We know how to do that, and we know when we read it as 7/10. But this is where it gets new. We want to write 7/10 as a decimal. Here's our decimal point, and we have a place value chart. But it's not like our normal place value chart when we did way back in chapter 1 at the beginning of the school year. Writing decimals in a place value chart is a little different because you're thinking that we're going to have ones or we're going to have tens, but we actually don't. When we want to write 7/10, when you hear 7/10, it's odd. It tells us we have tenths. We have 7 of them. And we don't have any ones. And we're going to get to that a little bit later, and it'll make more sense as to why we don't have any ones. The next page explains that a little bit better. There's going to be ones when we write a different fraction. And maybe you're thinking in your head what kind of fraction that might be, but it's not on this page. We're going to see it on the next page. Okay, so we don't have any ones, and we have 7/10. And I know it's hard to see. There's our decimal point. So we have 0.7. So we write that as 0.7. And again, we read it the same way as the fraction. This still reads as 7/10. Okay, we don't have any hundredths. We're not getting into that. Again, we'll get into that tomorrow. Okay, this, I'm going to pull up. Oh, I gotta have my mouse. I'm gonna come out of this for just a second, and I want to bring up this just so you can see it. This is very similar to what you just saw. This might be very helpful. Okay, I will post this on Class Dojo, but it might be beneficial for you. Maybe make a copy of this. This might help you when you're going through and trying to do the lesson. Write it on a piece of paper. If you have a whiteboard, if you have a sheet protector, whatever it may be, you can copy this down and it'll make it really easy for you. And I'm going to try and pull it up as we continue going through the lesson. All right, so let's continue. Another way that we can label a fraction as a decimal is to use a number line. And we've done number lines many, many times for many different concepts. Okay, so let's look. Label the number line with decimals that are equivalent to the fractions and locate the point 7/10. Okay, so they started it off for us. They started with the fraction 0/10, which means there's really nothing. So we write that as 0.0. Okay? Again, there's nothing in the ones, just like there was nothing in the ones up here. The numerator tells us a lot. 1/10 we write as 0.1. We have 1/10 and 0 ones. Okay. 2/10 we write as 0.2. We have 0 ones and 2 tenths. Now we have to keep on with that pattern. 3/10 will be written as, and I'm hoping I can get this. Nope, I don't think it's going to work. I'm gonna have to draw it in. I was hoping to make it a little clearer. We're gonna write 3/10 as 0.3. 0 ones and 3/10. Okay, you might be picking up on the pattern. 4/10 0 ones, point 4. 0 ones, 4 tenths. 5 tenths, 0 ones, and 5 tenths. We write it as 0.5. 6 tenths, 0 ones, and 6 tenths. So we write it as 0.6 and we read it as 6 tenths. 7 tenths, same thing. We still have 0 ones and we have 7 tenths. And if we look, our 0.7 matches our 0.7 up above. 8 tenths, again, we have 0 ones and we have 8 tenths. Last but not least, we have 9 tenths. So we write 0.9. And then lastly, they did this one for us. We have 10 tenths, which should be ringing in our head. We know 10 tenths, that's 1 whole. So now we have 1.0. Now you should be able to think, well, now we have something in the ones. When we make a whole, now we have something to write in that ones place. And again, that's going to be better explained on the next page. And to fill in our blank down at the bottom, blank names the same amount as 7 tenths. We know that 0.7 names the same amount as 7 tenths. So Ty read 0.7 of the book. Okay, so let's look down at the bottom. It says, how can you write 0.1 as a fraction? Explain. Okay, so this is when we should be thinking, let's look at what we've done so far. How would we write 0.1? There's nothing in the ones place, and we have 1. Think of what we did right here. We have 1 tenth. Because remember, this as a decimal is the tens place. So there's nothing in the ones but a 1 in that tens place. So we have 1 tenth, and that gives us our answer. So we know we can write it as 1 tenth. The digit 1 is in the tens place. Tenths place, excuse me, is in the tens place. So 0.1 is 1 tenth or 1 over 10. I'll let you get that written down. I'll erase up here and we'll move on to the next page. If it loads, there we go. All right. So let's look. Tara rode her bicycle 1/6 miles. What decimal describes how far she rode her bicycle? You have already written a fraction as a decimal. You can also write a mixed number as a decimal, okay? Alarm bells might be going off. This is where we're going to start seeing a digit in the ones place, a digit in the tens place, okay? So let's look. We can do it again in 3 different ways, just like we did on the page before. We can use a model and a place value chart. We're going to first start by shading the model. We have to shade 1 and 6/10. Now remember, that 1 is like saying we have 1 whole and another 6/10. So if we want to shade 1 and 6/10, we have to shade this whole thing to represent the 1. And then we have to come over here and now shade the 6/10 to represent the 6/10. So now we have 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. And now we have 1 and 6/10. And again, we know how to write that. It's the same as 1 and 6/10. Okay, now we can use that place value chart. Remember, 1 and 6/10 is 1 whole and an additional 6/10. Use the ones place to record wholes, okay? I'm going to star that because that's extremely important information. We're going to use the ones place to record our wholes, okay? So in this situation, we have 1 whole. So I'm going to put my 1 whole in the ones place. And my 6/10, my 6 is going to go in the 10th place. And now we put our decimal point and we read it as 1.6. We have 1.6. And we read this as, I'm going to text it in, we have 1 and 6/10. Okay, important information. It does not matter if it's a 1 out front, a 2 out front, a 3 out front, whatever whole number is out front, we're going to use the ones place to write it. And then we can fill in the rest. Okay, and we're going to practice it down here. They've started for us. We're still going to use the number line. We're going to label the number line with equivalent mixed numbers and decimals. Locate the point 1 and 6/10. Okay, so they started for us. They did 1 and 0/10, which we write as 1.0. We have 1 whole and we have 0/10. Now they did the mixed number for us. We have to fill in the decimal. We have 1 and 1/10. So we have 1 whole and we have 1/10. So we have 1.1. Next one, we have 1 and 2/10. Okay, so again, we still have 1 whole and we have 2/10. So now we have 1.2. 1 and 3/10, still a 1 out front. We have 1 whole and we have 3/10. tenths, so we have 1.3. Now we have to fill in the rest all on our own. So we have 1 3/10. We're going to continue with our pattern. It's going up by 1, so our next one's going to be 1 4/10. And our equivalent decimal is 1 whole 4/10, and we write it as 1.4. If we move on to our next one, continuing with our pattern, we have 1 5/10. If we want to write 1 5/10 as a decimal, again, we have our 1 out front, 1 whole, and our 5/10, and we write it as 1.5. I apologize that it's really crammed. There's not a whole lot of room. If we keep going, moving on from 1 5/10, we would get 1 6/10. The equivalent decimal to 1 6/10, we have our 1 whole out front, and we have 6/10, so we write 1.6. Couple more. Keeping on, we have 1 7/10. The equivalent decimal to 1 7/10, 1.7. Moving on, 1 after 1 7/10, we would get 1 8/10. Equivalent decimal to 1 8/10, 1 whole and 8/10, so we get 1.8. And last but not least, we have 1 whole. After 8, we have 9/10. Our equivalent decimal, we have 1 whole and 9/10. And they did the last part for us. See what I meant? There's a 2 out front. So now we have 2 wholes, 0/10, and we get 2.0. Okay, so we can do this. We don't have to just have 1 out front. We can have 2, 3, 4, 5, any whole number out front, we can write a decimal for it. I love the place value chart because it really is a helpful tool. And that's why I pulled up the other one, and I hope that it's helpful and you can use it. Again, the book's repetitive. 1 6/10 is the same as 1.6. So she wrote 1.6 miles. All right, we're moving right along. They want us to write one as a fraction and as a decimal. So they want us to shade the model to show 1. Well, to show 1, that's like saying we got to show 1 whole. So if we're shading to show 1 whole, we got to shade this whole thing in. Okay, and if we're shading the whole thing in, our whole equaled 10, just like it did up here. So our whole would equal 10 over 10. Okay, So now we got to figure out, how are we going to write 10 over 10? We know 10 over 10, we can actually even call this 1 over 1 because it still equals. Anything over itself equals 1 whole. So now we have to think. We have 1 whole. This all equals 1. We don't actually have any tenths. We know we have 1 whole, but there's no tenths. So we write 1 whole as 1.0. All right. Erase this up, and we're going to be trucking on to the last page. Remember, if you have any questions at all, you can always get in contact with me through Class Dojo. I am happy to help in any way I can, especially as we start moving along. I understand some of this is really, really complicated, so I am happy to help in any possible way. All right, let's look at this last page. Number 1, write 5/10 as a fraction and as a decimal. We know automatically how to write 5/10 as a fraction. We have 5/10. So now we have to think, how would we write 5/10 as a decimal? Well, I'm going to go ahead. Again, remember, we're at a 10 here. So I have to go ahead and shade 5 out of 10. So if I count 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, and I shade 5, we don't have any whole number out front. So therefore, we don't have any ones. And our numerator tells us how many tenths we have. So we have 5/10. So our decimal becomes 0.5. So we write it as 0.5. Okay, let's look at this one. They didn't tell us the fraction. We have to figure out what that fraction is and how we would write it as a fraction and a decimal. Okay, so they have 1 whole shaded, so that equals 1. Another whole shaded, so now we're up to 2 wholes, and we have 2 out of 10 shaded. So we should be able to say that this is 2 and 2/10. Okay, thinking back, if you need to use one of the place value charts, please do. I'm actually going to show it right underneath so we can see it. 2 and 2/10 we want to write as a decimal. This time we do have a whole. We have 2 wholes. So that means we have 2 in the ones place. And we have a decimal. And now we have how many tenths? 2. So now we have 2/10 and we write it as 2.2. So we have 2 and 2/10 or 2.2. Okay, let's look at this one. Now we have a number line. We have to figure out what fraction they're even showing on the number line before we can even convert it into a decimal. Okay, so we're looking for this fraction. Okay, they already gave us 5/10. and it's beyond 5/10. So I'm going to start right here, and I'm going to just count until I get there, because it's clear that these are going up by 1. We started at 0, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, and then another 5 got us to 10. So they're just going up by 1. So it's much easier to start at 5/10 instead of all the way back at 0/10. If I start at 5/10, it's going up by 1, so this next hash would be 6/10. Go ahead and write that in so we can see it. So this is 6/10, which means this next hash would be 7/10, which means our missing fraction is going to be 8/10. So we're trying to take the fraction 8/10 and put it into a decimal. Okay, again, I'm going to come up here so we can see it. 8/10, there's no whole number, so we don't have any ones. And we have 8/10, tells us exactly. So we write this as 0.8. So the fraction 8/10 turns into the decimal 0.8. Okay? They got a few questions for you to try on your own. You are more than welcome to give them a shot. Okay? As always, you will have your homework assignment. We'll turn to the next page and I'll give you the numbers to do. Okay? Your assignments will be posted on portfolios just like always. If we go to the homework, let's look. Remember, you only have to do the circled ones. If you want to do all of it, you are absolutely more than welcome, but just remember, you only have to do the circled ones. Okay, so I'm going to give you number 2 and number 3 because they're written in 2 different ways. Okay, I'm going to give you number 4, number 6, and number 7. Let's go with number 9. Okay, there's your questions to do on the front. 2, 3, 4, 6, 7, 9. And then on the back, let's go with number 2, number 3. Okay, factor. We did this a while ago. Write one number that is a factor of 13. Okay, so that means that you can multiply something to equal 13. What times what equals 13? You only need to write 1, but you should be able to think of 2. And let's go with number 6. Okay, what fraction of this model, or write the fraction of this model in simplest form. Okay, remember, simplest form. After you write the fraction, you need to divide. Okay, after you divide, you have to find the number that can go both into the numerator and the denominator. Once you have it found, write your answer on the line below. Okay, there is your assignment. It will be posted in Portfolio, as I mentioned, and I'll be back on for your lesson on Wednesday. Can't wait to see everybody.